very difficult to know. You see, if they could really control the weather, I don't think they'd allow a blizzard to happen when Obama landed in Copenhagen. So it certainly couldn't be that good. But I'm aware of these things that they are doing experiments with, and I know some things do work to an extent. Now, there's a curious little story about what happened in China recently, because in this period, the 17th to 19th of November, which we had predicted would be a lot of extreme weather, in China there was, the Chinese reported 3 million people had to be moved out of their homes because of absolutely massive snowstorms. And there was also a story around that, although there may have been natural processes going on, that they were also cloud seeding at the same time or just before, and it had made these worse. Now, the problem is, of course, we've got no way of verifying this, because the Chinese government aren't going to say that they did this, which resulted in 32 people dying when some buildings collapsed. But we do know as well there were very real events around the world which we had predicted a long time ahead.
Well,
so, and they're based on looking back in the past, so there's
sure.
no way that they could have, anyone knew what we were saying anyway. So,
well, I tend to agree with you, because I've talked to Ben Livingston, the father of weather weapons, and others, and he said they can, with the right conditions, they could make a hurricane, they could strengthen one or weaken one. But he said that when the giant weather system is coming in, that it's so huge that it's hard to control. But he says in smaller areas, they can manipulate things. And I would know, well, the Russians...
They've got to have the situation there already to be triggered, I would have thought, yes.
Absolutely. But on top of that, it isn't that they couldn't knock out a smaller snowstorm. The Russians brag they can do that. It's that if you've got a giant northern blast coming in, it would be too big for them to manipulate.
Oh, sure. I'm no doubt that I'm sure it can't be done, and well, I say never will be done, but you have to be careful about never these days. You just don't know what's possible. But, the Sun-Earth-lunar system is vastly more powerful than anything man can mobilize. But of course, if man can play at the critical edges when something is tipping one way or the other, then there are possibilities, but they only work at those times, and those times occur due to natural processes. So any control is only limited to certain sensitive areas, such as when our solar weather impact periods are happening, and those are very definitely periods when...
So what is going on with the sun right now? I mean, why have we been cooling for 9 years?
We've been cooling for 9 years, essentially because of the a decline in solar activity, and it being a odd sunspot cycle we're just leaving, and when that happens in an odd sunspot cycle, you will get less warming. We're also in the situation where the effect of the moon is to limit the effect of particles which would cause warming. When you get into an even cycle, things change, and in fact, even cycles are generally colder than odd cycles, and we're now entering an even cycle.
Sir, as a leading astrophysicist...
Obviously, with cycle 23, we're just finishing, and we started cycle 24.
Sure. As a leading astrophysicist and someone who studies the entire Earth, Sun, Moon relationship, what type of cycle or what area of the cycle were we in 9,000 years ago when the warming was, according to the graphs I've seen, much hotter than it's been in the last century?
Right. Well, to be specific, we'd have to look carefully, but the world temperature will depend on the solar activity and how well that activity actually reaches Earth, which is about magnetic connectivity. And that is going to be affected not just by the 22-year magnetic cycle of the Sun, but also by their close orientation of the Earth's axis relative to the Sun's magnetic axis. So there's that question. There's a question of the solar-lunar things, and then there's a question of the slow cycles of general solar activity, which they're not just operating on the scale of 11 years or so, but on hundreds of years, if not many hundreds of years. So it's going to be all those combinations of the solar activity, lunar modulations, and orientation. So I couldn't be specific exactly to say, but we should in principle be able to predict when in the future similar things will happen again.
When will we have something close to what happened during the beginning of the Bronze Age? I mean, the heating up.
Maybe never, because you see, sometime there's got to be a return to an ice age. The natural state of the world for the last few million years is ice ages, but with intermittent warm periods lasting, typically 10,000 years, which we're in now, and we are, in year 10,000 now. So logically, there is an ice age due. Now, it might have been that was almost an ice age coming at about 0 AD, because, since then, or 1000 AD, since then it has been notably colder, but we don't know. What we can say about the next 100 years is, according to our theory, and I don't like using the word model, because we base it on observations and equations rather than playing games with computers, although we do use computers, of course. Our theory shows that we're in for a continuing general cooling. There will be fluctuations in it, but we don't expect to ever get to above the 1998 levels of world.
Amazing. Let's get into their fraud when we come back. We've got a break, sir. Piers Corbyn as our guest. Amazing information. Finishing up with one of the leading, Piers Corbyn heads up weatheraction.com, a astrophysicist, meteorologist. His forecasts, from my research, are among some of the most accurate out there, years ahead. And he does this by knowing the history. Those that don't know history are doomed to repeat it. I believe Lord Acton said that, or did he say power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely?
He said a lot of things, I think.
Yeah, exactly. We've got a few minutes left here. We're going to come back with some longer segments. Specifically, I understand the ice age is 100, 200, 400, 500. We just know we're due for another one. We're going into a cooling trend now. What would an ice age look like?
Well, they take about a couple of thousand years to develop fully, but what happens is the ice caps in both hemispheres would increase in size, and it just gets progressively colder, and the sea freezes over in the polar regions, and it all just makes the moves towards the equator. So typically across the United States of America, you'd have an ice front, and an ice cap would extend there. And in the case of the last ice age in Britain, it went through the middle of Britain. So the south of England was actually not ice, and the Scotland and the whole of northern England and most of Ireland was covered in ice. And you could walk to Europe, and the whole of Russia would have been covered in ice, and Scandinavia covered in ice. So if an ice age comes, all those people would come south. So all the Canadians, Scandinavians and Russians would all come south. Or else they'd find ways of overcoming this by building things on the ice, which is an interesting idea.
Was there a more ancient ice age? I mean, because I know that the ice came all the way down to Texas. So some are bigger, some are smaller.
There were other ice ages which came down further than the last one. That is correct. They've been different sizes, and they happen typically every 100,000 years, or 90,000 years, or 120,000 years.
All right, we'll be right back. Back in 1 minute.